the kitchen staff didn't even try to hide it. When the service elevator doors opened, and Calvin Merritt stepped out, carrying his knife roll and a single duffel bag, 3 line cooks turned to look, then turned away. Not because he was unimpressive, because he was exactly what they expected, a middle-aged man in a faded gray Henley, no chef's whites, no brigade insignia, no restaurant group logo stitched across his chest. Just a guy who smelled faintly of dish soap and spent motor oil, which was what happened when you drove a 12-year-old Civic, and the AC stopped working somewhere outside of Columbus. The sous chef, a sharp-shouldered woman named Becca, glanced at the clipboard in her hand, then at him, then back at the clipboard with the particular expression of someone who had already decided but was giving the paperwork a chance to change their mind. "You're the prep hire," she said. "Not a question." "Calvin Merritt," he said. "Yes, ma'am." She handed him a black apron, and pointed toward the far end of the prep station without another word. That was his first morning at the Aldrich Grand, a 94-year-old hotel in downtown Cincinnati, that had hosted presidents, hosted jazz-age banquets, hosted a wedding reception for a governor's daughter in 1962 that people in the industry still talked about. The kind of place where the carpet in the lobby cost more per square foot than Calvin's monthly rent. He wasn't there for the prestige. He was there because the overnight prep position paid $19.40 an hour, offered benefits after 90 days, and started at 4 a.m., which meant he could get his daughter to school by 7:45, before his shift ended, and still be home when she got off the bus at 3:15. His daughter's name was Juniper, and she was 9 years old, and she still slept with a small stuffed rabbit named Captain that had belonged to her mother. Calvin didn't talk about her mother at work. He didn't talk about much at work. He came in, broke down cases of produce, ran the slicer, prepped the sauce bases, restocked the cold line, and left. 4 days a week, sometimes 5, the other cooks called him Quiet Cal, without intending it as a compliment, and he didn't take it as one. What most of them didn't know, what most people never knew, because Calvin had stopped mentioning it after it stopped mattering, was that he had spent 11 years as executive chef at a private dining club in Philadelphia called the Meridian. Not the kind of place that showed up in Yelp reviews. The kind of place where a table reservation required a member sponsor and a 6-week lead time, where the tasting menu changed with the season and the wine cellar held bottles older than the prep cooks currently mocking his apron. He had built that kitchen from a staff of 9 to a brigade of 22. He redesigned the pastry program from scratch. He earned a James Beard nomination 2 years running, not a win, but the kind of nomination that made other chefs look at you differently at industry events. Then his wife, Renee, got sick. She was 36. The diagnosis came in October and moved fast. The kind of fast that felt deliberate, like the disease was in a hurry to finish what it started. By February, Calvin had taken a leave of absence. By April, he had resigned. By June, Renee was gone, and Calvin was sitting in a house in suburban Philadelphia with a 9-year-old girl who asked twice a day when Mama was coming home, and no answer that felt survivable to say out loud. The bills didn't pause for grief. The mortgage didn't pause. The club found a replacement chef within 3 weeks, a younger guy from New York with a Michelin star and a social media following, and none of the institutional knowledge Calvin had spent a decade building. The wine cellar Calvin curated. The sauce reductions that took 4 years to standardize. The relationships with 7 regional farms. Gone, or rather, inherited by someone who didn't know what they were inheriting. Calvin didn't blame them, he just left. He moved to Cincinnati because his sister lived there, and he needed someone nearby who knew Juniper's name. He took whatever kitchen work he could find, a hotel breakfast line, a catering company's cold salad station, a school cafeteria for 11 weeks that broke something in him. He was still trying to identify. Then the Aldrich posted the prep position, and he applied because the hours fit, and the benefits were real, and sometimes that's all survival looks like. He told none of this to Becca or the line cooks or anyone else in that kitchen. Not because he was ashamed, exactly, but because he had learned that the story of what you used to be rarely helps you in the place where you currently are. The Aldrich's executive chef was a man named Frederick Bloom. And Frederick was not cruel, exactly, but he had the particular arrogance of someone who had been good at something for a long time, in a place where nobody questioned him. At 58, he ran the kitchen the way a feudal lord ran a territory, with absolute authority, selective generosity, and zero interest in input from below. Calvin watched him for 2 weeks before Frederick noticed him at all. When he did, it was not positive. It happened during prep for a Thursday dinner service. Calvin had been working on the stock for the consommé, a process that, at the Aldrich, involved a recipe card laminated in 2009 and unchanged since. Calvin had made a small adjustment, not dramatic, just a different sequence of adding the aromatics, a technique that reduced bitterness in the clarification without affecting the protein balance. He hadn't announced it, he had simply done it, because it was better, and because nobody was watching. Frederick tasted the consommé during his afternoon walkthrough. He stopped, he looked at the pot, he looked at the prep station, he looked at Calvin. "Who touched the consommé base?" "I did," Calvin said. "It tastes different." "Yes, sir." Frederick's jaw moved in a small, controlled way. "We don't do different here, Mr. Merritt. Mr. Merritt, we do consistent. Consistent is what keeps a 94-year-old hotel running." He set the ladle down. "Don't adjust what you didn't create." Calvin nodded. "Understood." Later, Becca pulled him aside near the walk-in. She wasn't unkind about it. "Frederick doesn't like surprises. He's been running this kitchen for 16 years. Just follow the cards." Calvin followed the cards. He did not stop noticing what was wrong with them. The Aldrich Grand's centennial gala was announced internally in January, 4 months away. 100 years, black tie, 300 guests, a sitting senator, 2 Fortune 500 executives, the mayor, and a woman named Harriet Bloom, no relation to Frederick, who had donated $4.2 million to the hotel's Historic Preservation Fund, and whose family had been guests at the Aldrich since 1931. The gala was scheduled for the second Saturday in May. The centerpiece of the evening was supposed to be a recreation of the original 1924 opening banquet menu. This was not Frederick's idea. It came from the board, specifically from the hotel's owner, a woman named Sylvia Crane. 67 years old, third-generation hospitality, the kind of compose that people mistake for cold, until something threatens what she loves, at which point you realize it was never coldness, just patience. Sylvia's grandfather had opened the Aldrich. Her grandmother had planned that first banquet menu, the original handwritten menu card, 6 courses, fountain pen, the paper gone sepia at the edges, lived in a frames in Sylvia's office behind her desk. The problem was that nobody knew how to make it. Not authentically. Not the way it had actually been made in 1924. The original recipes had never been formally documented. The suppliers no longer existed. 3 of the dishes referenced techniques that had fallen out of commercial use before World War II. Frederick's team spent 6 weeks attempting a reconstruction, and produced something that looked appropriate on paper, and tasted, in Sylvia's private assessment, like a hotel trying to remember something it had forgotten. She said as much to Frederick in a meeting Calvin was not present for. Frederick left that meeting, by all accounts, not visibly shaken but quieter than usual. He returned to the kitchen and announced that the gala menu was in development, and that anyone who had relevant expertise in historical American banquet cuisine should make it known. Nobody raised their hand, not because nobody had thoughts, but because offering expertise to Frederick Bloom in his own kitchen was the kind of career calculation most people decided against, before they got to the end of the sentence. Calvin was at the far end of the prep station, breaking down fennel, and he said nothing. But he went home that night and opened a box he hadn't opened in 3 years. The box was a banker's box, originally white, gone soft at the corners from moving 3 times. Inside were recipe notebooks, not digital files, not printed PDFs, actual spiral-bound notebooks in Calvin's handwriting, going back 15 years, research notes, technique logs. A full semester's worth of culinary history he had taken as an elective at the CIA, back when he was 24, and didn't yet know why it mattered. There was also a folder. Inside the folder were photocopies of primary sources, hotel records, estate menus, period cookbooks, that Calvin had collected over years of obsessive reading, the way other people collect vinyl or vintage cars. One of those photocopies was a partial transcription of a 1922 Chicago banquet menu from the Palmer House. Another was a trade journal article from 1919, describing the standard mise en place for American Grand Hotel dining rooms of the era. He had never used any of it professionally. He had kept it the way you keep something that matters without knowing why yet. He stayed up until 1 a.m. reading. At 3:30 a.m., he drove to the Aldrich for his shift. He didn't go to Frederick, he knew better than that. Instead, he went to Becca. He found her at 5:15 a.m. in the pastry corner doing prep math, and he put 3 pages of handwritten notes on the counter beside her elbow, without interrupting, then went back to his station. She didn't look at them immediately, but she looked at them. At 7:40 a.m., when the morning light had started coming through the kitchen's high windows and the breakfast rush was winding down, Becca came to find him at the cold station. "Where did this come from?" she asked, holding the pages. "Research," he said. "Personal. I have more if it's useful." She looked at him in a way nobody in that kitchen had looked at him before. Not warm, exactly, but recalibrated. "Frederick's going to want to know who put this together, I know." She studied him for a moment. "Are you ready for that?" He thought about Juniper at home. Still asleep, Captain the Rabbit tucked under her arm. He thought about the mortgage. He thought about the 90-day benefits clock. "Not really," he said, "but I'm not going to pretend I don't know what I know." Becca brought the notes to Frederick that afternoon. Frederick read them. He read them twice, which Becca later told Calvin was the most attention she had ever seen him give to anything he hadn't written himself. Then he called Calvin into the small glass-walled office adjacent to the main kitchen, where the prep cooks could see but not hear. Frederick sat, Calvin stood. The chair across the desk was not offered. "You researched historic American banquet cuisine," Frederick said. "Yes, sir, on your own time." "Yes, sir, you're a prep cook." A pause. "Currently." Something moved across Frederick's face, that was not quite a smile. "What's your background, Merritt?" Calvin told him. Not the whole story. Not Renee, not Juniper, not the box in the corner of the bedroom with the notebooks from 1924. Just the professional timeline, the Meridian, the Brigade, the Beard nominations. Frederick listened without interruption, which was, by all accounts, unusual. Then he said, "Why are you here?" "My daughter needed stability," Calvin said. "The hours fit." Another pause. Frederick looked out through the glass at the kitchen. His kitchen, for 16 years. "I'll look at what you've put together," he said. "Don't expect anything." Calvin nodded and went back to prep. What happened next took 2 weeks, and was not comfortable. Frederick incorporated several of Calvin's research notes into his revised menu proposals, without attribution, which Calvin had expected. He also made 3 technique errors in the interpretation. The kind of errors that wouldn't be obvious to most people, but would produce dishes that were period accurate in appearance, and subtly wrong in flavor. Calvin wrote the corrections in his notebook, and said nothing about them publicly. The menu went to Sylvia Crane for review. She rejected it, not harshly. Sylvia was not a harsh woman. But she was precise, and she had grown up listening to her mother describe what the Aldrich had tasted like in its prime. The mock-up Frederick presented had the architecture of the era, but not the soul of it. Something was missing, she couldn't name it, but she had the instinct for it. She asked for another revision. Frederick, by then, was 7 weeks from the gala, running out of time, and running out of answers he could find on his own. He called a kitchen-wide meeting. He laid the problem on the table, not with humility exactly, but with the particular bluntness of a man who had no room left for pride. "If anyone has an actual solution to this, now is the time." 3 seconds of silence. Then, Calvin said from the back of the room, "I do." The room turned. Becca looked at her clipboard. One of the younger line cooks, a guy named Trev, who had been at the Aldrich for 4 years, and had opinions about seniority, made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Frederick looked at him with an expression that gave away nothing. "Talk," he said. Calvin talked for 22 minutes. He laid out a framework for authentic reconstruction of the 1924 menu, using documented sourcing records from 2 comparable properties of the era. He identified which flavor profiles in the original dishes were dependent on period-specific technique versus ingredient availability, and which of those techniques were still executable with modern equivalents. He had a solution for the stock issue, for the pastry course, for the preparation sequence, that would allow a modern brigade to execute an era-authentic menu, without losing plate timing on a 300-cover service. He also, and this was the part the room went quiet for, identified that the original centerpiece dish, the one Sylvia's grandmother had written at the top of the menu card in fountain pen, was a preparation that hadn't been widely used in American hotel kitchens since the 1940s. He had found a 1931 reference to it in the Palmer House records. He had worked out a reconstruction. He had tested it at home, at midnight on a Tuesday, while Juniper slept upstairs. When he finished, there was a long pause. Frederick said, "You tested this at home." "My daughter's rabbit gave it a sniff of approval," Calvin said. "He has high standards." Nobody laughed. One person almost did. Frederick looked at him for a long moment. "All right," he said, "you're off prep. You're on gala development, starting today." Trev started to say something. The look Frederick gave him ended it before the first syllable finished forming. The next 6 weeks were the most alive Calvin had felt since Philadelphia. He came in early. He stayed late. He drove home in the dark, walked up the stairs, peeked into Juniper's room to see the rise and fall of her breathing, and thought, this is what it's for. Not the career, not the recognition, just the specific piece of being useful again, of knowing something and having somewhere to put it. Juniper knew something had changed. She didn't have the vocabulary for it yet, but she noticed that her father hummed now while making dinner. She noticed he brought home small things. A piece of spiced shortbread he was testing, a tiny ramekin of something warm she couldn't name. She ate whatever he offered without hesitation, because she was 9 years old, and she trusted him in the simple absolute way that children trust the parent who stayed. One evening, she asked what the fancy food was for. "A party," he told her. "At the hotel where I work." "Is it a really fancy party?" "Very." "Will there be a cake?" "Better than a cake." She considered this with great seriousness. "I hope they like it," she said. He put his hand on top of her head. "Me too, bug." At the hotel, things were not without friction. Trev made his feelings about the situation known through a campaign of small insubordinations, delayed prep times, miscounts on the mise en place, the particular slowness of a person who wants you to need him more than you do. Calvin absorbed it without reaction, which frustrated Trev more than any confrontation would have. Frederick was complicated. He was not generous with credit, and he communicated primarily through the presence or absence of criticism. When he walked through the gala kitchen and said nothing, that was approval. When he paused and adjusted something with his own hands without comment, that was correction. Calvin learned to read both. The other cooks began to calibrate. It happened slowly, the way temperature changes happen in a large kitchen. You don't notice the moment it shifts, you just realize at some point that it's different than it was. By the 3rd week, the 2 youngest cooks on the gala team were coming to Calvin first with questions, not because it was sanctioned, but because he answered them clearly, and without making them feel smaller for asking. Becca, for her part, said very little, but showed up consistently. She rearranged the prep schedule twice, to give Calvin the station time he needed, without making it look like a favor. Calvin noted this and didn't mention it, which was the correct response. Sylvia Crane visited the kitchen 3 weeks before the gala. She was not an imposing woman physically, medium height, silver-streaked hair pulled back, sensible shoes, but she had the quality that certain people in certain families acquire, over generations of tending to something larger than themselves, a quality that Calvin could only describe as groundedness. She stood in the kitchen without making it feel like an inspection. Frederick introduced her to the gala team. He introduced Calvin last and, to his credit, used his actual title. Calvin Merritt, who's heading up our historical reconstruction. It was the first time Frederick had said that out loud. Sylvia shook Calvin's hand. "Frederick tells me you've been working on the 1924 centerpiece." "Yes, ma'am. My grandmother's dish," she said. It wasn't a reminder, it was the weight of the thing, stated plainly. "I know," he said. "I want to get it right." She looked at him for a moment. Not the way Frederick looked at him, assessing, calculating, but the way someone looks at a person they're deciding whether to trust. "Would you show me what you have?" she asked. He showed her. She tasted 3 components in sequence, asking questions between each one, not testing, just wanting to understand. She asked about the sourcing decisions. She asked about the 1931 Palmer House reference. At the end she stood quietly for a moment with the small tasting spoon still in her hand. "My mother described this dish once," she said. She said it tasted like the hotel when it was new, like the city hadn't forgotten how to celebrate yet. She paused. "You're close, tell me where I'm off," Calvin said. She did. "1 note, A brightness she remembered her mother describing, something floral, barely there. Calvin nodded and didn't write it down. He went home that night and worked until 2 a.m. He found it, the night of the gala. Calvin arrived at 6 a.m. for a 7 p.m. service. He put on his chef's whites for the first time in 3 years. Juniper had pressed them for him the night before, standing on a step stool at the ironing board, with an expression of intense concentration that looked so much like her mother's it stopped him cold for a moment in the doorway. He had to look away before she could ask why. The kitchen ran the way a well-built kitchen runs on a big night, with the specific controlled tension of people who know what they're doing but also know that knowing isn't enough and execution is everything. Calvin moved through his stations, made his checks, tasted, adjusted, confirmed. He corrected one seasoning, redirected one timing sequence, and said thank you to every person who handed him something. Trev, to his credit, showed up and did his job. Not more than his job, but his job. At 6:45 Frederick came to Calvin's station. He stood there for a moment watching the centerpiece preparation. "You're ready," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." Frederick nodded once. "Good." He started to leave, then stopped. Turned back. "What you found in those records, the 1931 sourcing sequence. I've been in this industry 30 years. A pause. "I hadn't seen that." Calvin said nothing. "That's all," Frederick said, and left. Service began at 7 p.m. 300 guests in black tie, crystal glasses, candles in the holders that had stood in that dining room for 60 years. The senator arrived, the mayor arrived. Harriet Bloom, 81 years old in a navy gown, was helped to her seat by a young woman Calvin later learned was her granddaughter. The first 4 courses went to the floor without incident. The centerpiece came out at 9:14 p.m. The room, already warm and loosened by 3 hours of champagne and conversation, went quiet in the specific way. Rooms go quiet when something lands in front of them that they were not expecting. Not silence exactly, more like a held breath. Sylvia Crane, seated at the host table, was the first person to taste it. She took one bite. She set down her fork. She looked toward the kitchen doors, the round porthole windows, through which the expediter traffic moved. The brief view of stainless steel and motion, and she pressed her fingertips together in front of her lips. For a moment, the gesture of someone trying to hold something in. Then she composed herself, picked up her fork and took a second bite. At 9:31 p.m. the dining room applauded, not for the service team, not for anyone specific. The applause started at table 6 and spread. The spontaneous, unprompted kind that happens when a group of people simultaneously decides that something deserves it. Harriet Bloom, at table 2, put both hands on the edge of the table, and closed her eyes for a moment, with the expression of someone returning somewhere they had been a long time ago. Calvin was standing at his station in the kitchen when Becca came through the swing door and said, simply, "Sylvia wants to see you." He looked at the stack of mise en place still to be broken down. "Go," Becca said. "I've got this." He found Sylvia near the entrance to the dining room, where the corridor opened into a small alcove, lined with framed photographs of the Aldrich across the decades. The 1924 opening, a 1940s Christmas banquet, a photograph from 1968 of a reception for a visiting dignitary, a photograph from last New Year's that looked very new beside the others. She was holding a glass of water when he arrived. She offered her hand. "Calvin," she said. "Messrs. Crane, that was my grandmother's dish," she said. "The way my mother described it." She paused. "Where did you find the brightness?" "The floral note at the finish? Dried elderflower," he said. "Cold infused into the stock reduction rather than steeped. It preserves the volatiles. You don't taste it as much as you sense it." She nodded slowly. "How long have you been doing this kind of work?" "About 15 years of practice," he said. 3 years of not doing it." She looked at him with the same assessing calm she had used in the kitchen 3 weeks ago. "Your daughter," she said. "You mentioned her once, in the kitchen." He was surprised she had held on to that. "Juniper. She's 9. Does she know what her father does?" "She knows I make food people like." Sylvia smiled. A real one, the first he'd seen from her. "I would like to make you an offer," she said. "Not tonight. The gala is still running, and I won't conduct business while my guests are at the table. But I'd like to meet with you this week." He waited. "The Aldrich has been discussing a culinary heritage program," she said, "documenting the hotel's food history, developing programming around it, dinners, events, an educational component in partnership with the Cincinnati culinary community. It's been in conversation for 2 years and nothing has moved because we've never had the right person. She paused. I believe we might now. Calvin looked at the photographs on the wall. The 1924 opening. The dining room full of people in a world that no longer existed, eating a meal that had been lost, and tonight found again. What would the role look like? He asked. We can discuss that this week, she said, but I'll tell you this, it would be named. It would carry the full backing of the Aldrich Board and the Preservation Endowment, and it would be yours to build. She paused. There's one more thing. I'd like the program to carry a name, a dedication. I do this with all significant initiatives at the hotel. It's a tradition my grandfather started. She looked at him carefully. Would you like to tell me who the right person would be? He was quiet for a moment. My wife, he said. Her name was Renee. Sylvia nodded. Then the Aldrich Culinary Heritage Program will be established in memory of Renee Merritt. He didn't speak. He couldn't, quite. He looked at the photographs again. All those people who had moved through this building over 100 years, all that food served and forgotten and sometimes, not entirely, lost. She would have loved this place, he finally said. Tell me about her sometime, Sylvia said. I'd like to know who we're honoring. Later, well past midnight. After the last guest had gone, and the kitchen had been broken down and the dining room restored to silence, Calvin sat in the Aldrich's service corridor on a stool near the pastry station with a cup of coffee and his phone. He called his sister. She answered on the second ring, sleep-roughened. How did it go? She asked. Good, he said. It went good, just good. He looked at the empty corridor, the industrial ceiling, the hum of the refrigeration units that never stopped. Something happened tonight, he said. I'll tell you about it in the morning. He drove home in the dark, let himself in quietly, hung his chef's whites on the hook by the door, still clean, miraculously after a 10-hour service, and walked upstairs. Juniper's door was cracked open. He pushed it gently and stood in the doorway. She was asleep on her side, Captain tucked against her chest, one arm wrapped around the rabbit the way she had slept since she was 4 years old. Her breathing was slow and even, and completely unconcerned with the world. He watched her for a long time. Then he went to bed, and for the first time in 3 years, he fell asleep before the thinking started. The announcement came the following Thursday. Sylvia sent a hotel-wide message that went to every department. Frederick Bloom was CC'd, Becca was CC'd. The entire kitchen staff received it in their inbox, between the morning breakfast wrap-up and the lunch prep briefing. The Aldrich Grand was proud to announce the establishment of the Aldrich Culinary Heritage Program, dedicated to the preservation and celebration of the hotel's 100-year food history. The program would be led by Calvin Merritt, newly appointed Director of Culinary Heritage, in a role created to reflect the hotel's commitment to its founding legacy and its future. The program was established in memory of Renee Merritt. Trev read it twice. He put his phone down. He picked it up again and read it a third time, then went back to his mise-en-place without saying anything. Becca walked to Calvin's station and stood there for a moment. Congratulations, she said. Thank you, he said, for the notes. And for the schedule adjustments. She shook her head slightly, not a denial, just a redirect. You did the work, still, he said. She nodded once, then she went back to hers. A week later, Juniper asked to see where her father worked. He brought her on a Saturday morning before the lunch service. He walked her through the kitchen slowly, the prep stations, the cold line, the pastry corner, the walk-in with its towers of organized containers. She asked questions about everything, precise and serious in the way she was about most things, the way her mother had been. At the end of the tour, he showed her the small office that was now his. A room with a window, a desk, and 2 walls of shelving already beginning to fill with research materials. On the corner of the desk, he had placed a small framed photograph. Him and Renee, 10 years ago, in the kitchen of their first apartment, cooking something he could no longer remember, both of them laughing. Juniper looked at it for a long time. Mama's here, she said. Yeah, he said. I thought she should be. She reached up and took his hand. They stood there for a while in the quiet of the office, with the sounds of the kitchen coming through the walls. The familiar rhythm of prep. The low murmur of cooks at their stations. The whole working machinery of a place that had been feeding people for 100 years. And Calvin Merritt, who had once believed that the best version of his life was already behind him, stood in a room with his name on the door, and his daughter's hand in his, and realized, slowly and without drama, that he had been wrong about that. Sometimes the people who disappear from the world don't disappear forever. Sometimes they find their way back through the one door that was always open. The one that faces not the past, but forward.